I want to talk this afternoon about the title, The Emergence of the Apocalyptic Tradition in the Bible. This way we'll sort of get a running start and get right to the edge of the book of Revelation. I will say one thing I noticed in my course description that I didn't assign for next week is that you'd read the first chapter of the book of Revelation. It would have been nice to put that in there, but somehow or other it got out. So be sure that you do read the first chapter, which we want to cover next week. Looking at my Greek text of the book of Revelation, the book starts off this way: the apocalypse of Jesus Christ, which God gave to him to show to his servants. The word the first word in the book of Revelation in Greek is apocalypsis, which we have put up in a translated form there on the board. The apocalypsis of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show to his servants. So this is clearly a descriptive heading for the title of the book. The word apocalypsis means unveiling. Unveiling. And it's like the ceremonies that we have in many official situations where you come to a formal ceremony and some work of art or some statue is covered, and then at the appropriate time the covering is pulled off, it's unveiled, and we all look at the great work of art or the statue, the work that is behind it. I can hardly think about this, however, where it's been satirized by the Marx Brothers, one of their famous movies. And so people have kind of satirized a lot. But still, it is the idea that the curtain is pulled off, and we don't have behind it the Wizard of Oz, but we have some wonderful work of art or some wonderful reality. And so Revelation claims to unveil the secrets and the purposes of God for his people of the first century. And here we want to make an important point right at the beginning. It's a point we will come back to several times in the course. I want to argue, at least in this course, that these secrets and purposes of God, that Revelation pulls the curtain away and we begin to get a look and see them, are not meant to be understood as some kind of transcript of the future. I'm not sure whether you're aware of the work called Nostradamus that has played a role that supposedly goes back to 1500 to 1555, where this French writer, supposedly got a kind of timeline of the future events in Western civilization under some kind of symbolism. And this is something important. People can't let this go. They seem to think that somewhere out there God has some kind of a code that He has for how things are exactly going to take place. And when we talk about secrets and the elements of what will take place in the future, this is what so many people zero in on. I don't believe that God has put down every last thing into some kind of transcript, and He's embedded it in, whether it be Nostradamus or whether it be the Bible. Yes, He's given us a general outline of things, and He's given us some theories and some views about how these things are going to take place. But as far as dates, times, and places that people tend to want to build into things, I'm not so sure that that's what the book of Revelation is about. So I think it's helpful then to ask ourselves, when we talk about an apocalypse as pulling away the curtains or the covers and giving us a look at God's, or as the unveiling of God's secrets, I think it's good then to see, where does this kind of fit in to the Bible? Because one of the things I want you to see in this course is Revelation brings to a completion the biblical story. Really is very much an amazing point. And if you ever get a good study Bible, it'd be an interesting little exercise just to go down the sides of the Bible study guide or the footnotes and see how many echoes there are to other places in the Scriptures. When we get into the chapters 4 and 5 and onwards into the vision, into the second vision, you will see that in this book, almost every verse of the Bible echoes another text. It's really strange because it doesn't quote them directly. Some people have argued there's not one place where it quotes it directly. There's some that are pretty close, I would want to argue. But they're echoes of other texts, and it's like a fine weaver pulling together threads from a tremendous amount of places in the Scripture, normally what we call the Old Testament, and bringing it to completion. And that's really how I think we're to understand the bringing out of these divine secrets, which were already there in much of Scripture, but are now in this final book brought to completion. Now, the word apocalypse, this is the first time in any kind of literature it's used of a literary work. And so that doesn't necessarily mean, however, that the idea is coming to the fore for the first time. So I want to kind of go back a little bit in the Bible, in the biblical story, and give you this afternoon a kind of feeling for the whole idea. Where does apocalypse and apocalyptic literature, or sometimes we use the translation revelatory literature, come from? So that's what we're going to do this afternoon. Take a brief overview of where the idea of revelatory literature comes about in the biblical tradition, brings us up to this book, Revelation, which I do not believe is as strange as some of us want to make it out to be. Let's do a major heading here and talk about the early search for understanding the purposes of God in Israel. Let's go back into the Old Testament and take a look very quickly and in a general sense at some basic things here. Yeah, the early search for understanding the purpose of God in Israel. In the Old Testament, the classical way of talking about how God reveals his purposes for humankind is to say that God shares his intent for his people in history. Now, it's a kind of uptown way of saying, well, how do we understand God? How do we come to know him? God shows his purposes in history. It's interesting to note that one of the names for God in the Bible is, of course, the name Yahweh. And Yahweh, people still argue about how we put the vowels here, but usually spelt Y-A-H-W-E-H. Yahweh can be italicized in a number of different ways, but an explanation of the name, of course, occurs in the book of Exodus, when God is having a dialogue with Moses about going back to Egypt. And in Exodus chapter 3, verses 13 through 16, you have the famous places where God reveals himself. In many of the translations, it, of course, comes out as I am. But my teachers, I think, at least made to me a very convincing proposal that I have maintained over the years, and that is that the word really means I will cause to be whatever will be. I will cause to be whatever will be. Moses asked, well, how do I know who and by what authority I'm to do these things? And he's told it's Yahweh, or the one who will cause to be whatever will be. In other words, God is telling his people, the children of Abraham, and now on, of course, through Moses, that he will show himself in what he does with his people. You look at what's happening to your people, you look at their destiny and what's taking place in history, and that's how you can understand the secrets and the revelation of who I am. And so that then develops along in the Old Testament. And of course, much of the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament has a lot to do then with the prophets, who are always interpreting what the people are doing in their history under the leadership of Yahweh. The prophets then play a very, very important role in all of this. And one of the great passages in the prophets comes up in 2 Kings chapter 5, verses 15 through 17. If I were asked, aside from some of the passages in Isaiah, to turn to my favorite texts in all of the Old Testament, this would certainly be one of 2 Kings chapter 5, verses 15 through 17. And in this passage, we're told about the prophet Elisha. And Elisha is told about how he is to go out and the Syrians are attacking him, and there's a terrible situation that it looks like the city is about to fall, and the servant comes out and says, "There's no hope. It's all over." And then in this passage in 2 Kings, I'm looking at my chapter 5 here, but maybe someone can find that passage for me here. It's the story about how the servant, things are about to fall, and Elisha says, "Look up." And he sees all of the hosts of the heavenly angels who are about to free him. You are not alone. And that's the famous passage where the angels are there with the chariots of fire. Chapter 6, is it? I've written down 6, 15 through 17. Is that? Yes, okay. Yeah, I've written chapter 5 here and 16. Yeah. 2 Kings chapter 6. Of the man of God rose early next morning. He saw a force with horses and chariots surrounding the town. See the point I'm making? The prophet sees a reality beyond mere human appearance. He sees something different than what ordinary people. And it goes on to say, "O Master," he said, "which way are we to turn?" And the prophet here, Elisha, answers, "Do not be afraid, for those on our side and those on theirs." And he offered this prayer, "Lord, open his eyes and let him see." The Lord opened the young man's eyes, and he saw the hills covered with horses and chariots of fire all around the prophet. You see, there are realities out there that are beyond ordinary eyesight and earsight. And that's what the prophets, of course, saw. They were taken to the heavenly places, and there they did see things in the heavenly sanctuary where God was speaking with the heavenly court and deciding what he would do. And the prophets then come back and speak this to the world. For a while they saw the secrets unveiled in history, and then they would come and speak them to the world. That's the role of the prophets. And so that becomes then the beginning of the revelatory tradition in Judaism. There are other passages there. I got the reference wrong in 2 Kings, but in 1 Kings 22, this one is right, verses 19 through 28, you also have that same idea with the prophet there, Micaiah. Now, as this revelatory tradition begins, by the time of the exile in the Old Testament, the Jews had lost much of their educated elite, but they still had a good number of scribes. And the scribes made it their business to be the custodians of the traditions of the people. And especially by this time, both the Torah and the prophets are being collected. Especially, this was an interesting time when the great stories of many of the figures of the past who were thought to be very, very close to God began to be collected. And so it is in this era, after the exile, that you begin to get collections amongst the Jews of these stories of figures who are close to the Divine One. Particularly stories about Enoch, because Genesis chapter 5 verses 21 through 24, Enoch, of course, walked with God. He was with God, and God took him. These stories, collected by the scribes, finally begin to be put into particular books about the exploits of these individuals who are very close to God and begin to understand some of the secrets of the Divine One. They have been collected in later times into 2 volumes that we now have before us. And these volumes are called, not a very good name, the pseudepigrapha. Which means false writings. That doesn't, I think, help us too much. They mean false writings because this is a term that's been given by later editors, in that we believe these are stories about Enoch, or stories about Moses, or stories about Elijah, people who were close to God and God took him. Others who were very close students of the law, like Ezra. There are something like 70 to 80 books or collections of stories in this pseudepigrapha. As you can see, it's a very, very large body of material, and it's a wealth of background to understanding the Jewish people of the centuries after the time of the exile, 5 or so centuries before Christ, and down, and even into the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Christian era. These stories are told and they are collected. And now you're not only getting these stories, as it were, that are talking about how God was with his people in history, but you're beginning to get these stories that give a lot of other information about the Jewish people. And so you get ancient works on science, works about how the people of Israel are to live, and particularly works that have to do with the end of history. And here we come now to a very important distinction. And the distinction is this. You'll see it in so many different bodies of writing. It's the distinction between the prophetic and what is sometimes called the apocalyptic. What we mean by the prophetic is the idea in the Old Testament about the prophets. When you read Isaiah, when you read Ezekiel, Zechariah, and all of these prophets, normally they have some revelatory idea that they've been transported by vision or dream into the heavenly sanctuary. They've heard God's word. It's usually for some particular crisis or action that is taking place in the immediate history of the Jewish people. And so the Syrians have invaded, as we've found. The Babylonians have invaded. What are we to do? And so a prophetic word is given to these people. But apocalyptic, picking up on these stories transmitted by the scribes about Daniel, particularly chapter 7 through 12 in the Old Testament, and then all of these writings about Enoch and Moses and so forth that are beyond the time of the Bible. Apocalyptic, the word, of course, which we have right at the beginning of the book of Revelation, is this. So let me give you this definition, which is important. It's a mode of revealing God's secrets. Visionary descriptions of ancient figures, a mode of revealing God's secrets, visionary descriptions of ancient figures, or trips in the heavenly regions, wherein they are given access to some of the divine secrets. They say that again, a mode of revealing God's secrets, visionary descriptions of ancient figures, or trips into the heavenly regions wherein they're given access to divine secrets. And this is exactly what we find when we get into the book of Revelation. Book of Revelation follows right on this. Only this is the revelation of Jesus Christ. And it is given then to the Apostle John. In fact, it'd be interesting if we turn over now to the first verse of Revelation. We read a little bit of it just a while ago, but now let's come back and take a look at it. And it says, "This is a revelation of Jesus Christ, an apocalypse of Jesus Christ, which God gave him so that he might show his servants what must soon take place. He made it known by sending his angel to his servant John." Now, if you kind of look at this, you've got a kind of a list. You have God, you have Jesus Christ, we have John, and finally we have the servants, or the people in the churches. And the book of Revelation really, in its most general sense, has to do with two visions. Two visions from Jesus Christ. One is an assessment to the churches in Revelation, really chapters 1 through 3. And the other, through the most of the book, it starts at chapter 4 and then goes through the end of the book, is a revelation really about the future. And that's the more difficult and the more challenging book, chapters 4 through chapter 21. And so really what I'm saying here this afternoon is, as you have these great figures in history, stories are being told about Daniel, chapters 7 through 12. Stories are being told about Moses. You have a book in the pseudepigrapha called The Assumption of Moses. Stories about Enoch. There are literally hundreds of chapters of stories that are told about Enoch that the Jews collected, because he was said to be close to God and God was with him. Now the prophet John receives a revelation from Jesus in two visions, and it follows right on. And in that way, it really succeeds the prophets, because the prophets had to do with, when we say something is prophetic, it had to do with events that were immediately at hand, but apocalyptic. And, you know, today we use the word apocalyptic, we throw it around and give it many, many different meanings. You know, something's apocalyptic. Well, you're about to let off atomic bombs or something like that. You know, it's very explosive. It's very high voltage. But apocalyptic in a biblical sense is expanding what God is doing immediately at a particular time in history and giving a wider concept or a wider evaluation or a wider description of his purposes and directions. And what the book of Revelation is really about then is to a church, 7 little churches in the eastern provinces of Asia, the Roman province of Asia, and these 7 little churches are facing a particular set of crises. And guess what the crisis is? It's a crisis of being caught up and submerged in the culture of the time. Now, doesn't that sound familiar to us? Doesn't it? To be totally inundated by the forces and powers of a culture that looks like it's going to be totally triumphant. The power of Roman culture and influence. And the book of Revelation is saying there's another way of looking at this, and that is God's way of seeing what is really going on. And it's not Rome where the future and the victory rests. It is in someone who is labeled to be the Lamb. And we'll look at what that means, because sometimes this revelatory or esoteric literature, as we saw with Daniel, and you can see in some of these works, the apocalyptic talk in symbols and images and beasts. In this wider perspective, it's the Lamb who really rules history, not Caesar. And what John is wanting to say is that's how we really understand. So in conclusion this afternoon, when we look at reality, Revelation is saying, there is man's perspective. And then there is God's perspective. Revelation makes the claim to give us God's perspective. And in the end, only that counts. And in God's perspective, then, He will establish His reign over all creation. So, we've made a very quick little tour through the Bible, in a kind of sense. God shows Himself in history, but that history, particularly as it unfolds through the prophets, only gives us a small aspect or a small look on the total reality of things. We could have talked a little bit more about wisdom literature, which gives us some more things. But finally, through the works of the scribes, they maintained these stories about people who were particularly close to God and got certain ways of understanding that extended that knowledge. But when we come down to the time of the New Testament, in view of the Christ event, these need to be updated, and the prophet John, in his apocalypse, or in his revelation, which he claims, of course, comes from Jesus, gives us a perspective on particularly how the people of God are going to survive and not be totally inundated by the culture. And so, with that perspective, they're looking at the idea that there are two great visions. We're now ready to jump in and take a look at the book of Revelation next week. We'll have a lot more, of course, to say about its particular setting and context after we have done some reading. But before we talk about next week and finish up today here, let's take a look, or let's just open it up. And by the way, we're all ready. We've got a larger group here, but we're all always ready to take a question. And so, why don't we go ahead?
When you spoke about the mode of revealing God's secrets, was that initially in the pseudepigrapha?
Yeah, it has to do with some things that expand beyond the normal idea of God revealing himself in history. There's a lot that could be said about this. There's an English scholar, a fellow by the name of Christopher Rowland, who has written a large book called The Open Heaven that traces this. It's still a very, very fine book, and it's just something. When we're taking a look at Revelation, we just have to be a little bit abbreviated here, but just draw your attention to that. And what Roland is basically saying is the difference between a prophetic and apocalyptic is that it expands into this knowledge about what are the divine secrets, whereas the prophets primarily dealt with what Israel had done wrong in keeping the covenant and where they had gone wrong in history. Now, in the pseudepigraphal works and so forth, you get long discourses on the nature of science, the nature of different kind of knowledge, different kind of expansion of wisdom, and so forth, because people really want to know. It's an excellent question, but you might get a kind of a little bit of a feeling about it if you look at the end of the book of Job. Remember, Job wanted to know exactly why he was having all these problems, and he finally gets around, after many, many chapters, toward the end of the book of Job, to ask God about these things. Rather a presumptive kind of position that he takes, that he raises questions about how God is running the world, and he doesn't always see eye to eye about this. And then in Job chapter 38 and 39, he raises the question, and God, at the beginning of chapter 38, answers, "Then the Lord answered Job out of the tempest. Who is this who darkens counsel and words devoid of knowledge? Brace yourself, stand up like a man. I shall put questions to you, and you must answer." And then, of course, he goes on for 2 chapters. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Now, there are a lot of people, though, who want to press to find the answers to how God controls these things. And so this was their way of finding and determining these secrets. And there's a kind of a tension. Some would say you can only go so far, but others press on, and the ones who press on are the esoteric, the apocalyptic, the revelatory people who press this. Many people think that, like say with Daniel, it's the only real form of this in the Old Testament. The Jews tend to keep that a little bit at length, but it finds its way into the New Testament with, I think, the perspective that we have in Revelation of John, where you're given a wider perspective than just a little bit of information about immediate situation. It's a long answer to the question. I'll try and answer these questions a little shorter, but it was a good question. Other observation?
How would you differentiate between the pseudepigrapha and the apocryphal writings? Are they subsets of each other? Or?
Okay, you mean the let's put up the word apocryphal, R-Y-P-H-A-L. Apocryphal really has to do in the Old Testament with the books, many of them written at the time of the Greek culture and captivity, that were either written in Greek or translated into Greek, and were not regarded as so sacred they had to be read in the holy in the holy services and worship of the Jewish people. And so they were primarily then maintained by Christians, because the Christians kept the Greek Bible. From time to time they were read, and they become the what we call the Deuterocanon, that were later translated into Latin and became part of I have to be careful here. They weren't really the scripture of the Catholic Church, but they became important for the Catholic Church. Protestants at the time of the Reformation, I think, kept a little bit closer to the Jews on that particular point. But the apocryphal writings are really not apocalyptic. They have to do with matters of wisdom, matters of history, various things. So they are different, quite different in many senses from what we call the pseudepigraphal writings, which cover a number of areas as well. But the pseudepigraphal writings are talking about these people who are close to God. And really, they're just a wonderful mine of various stories of the Jews. And a lot of them have to do with these heavenly journeys, like the Book of Enoch and Fourth Ezra and those. So they sort of fall into a particular genre that is closer, I think, to what the Book of Revelation is talking about, is this idea that one is receives visions and an understanding of reality from God. What I'm simply saying is the Book of Revelation just didn't drop out of the sky. There's already a long history of this kind of writing, and so people who are around then could have some kind of way of approaching it and understanding it in the first century. Of course, the prophet John, as we'll see next week, most of you already know, he's off on the Isle of Patmos. He's a little off the coast of the Western Turkey or the Roman province of Asia. And one of the interesting things we're going to discover is people have always romanticized that this is a little island and this is a little place where John was by himself. He just kind of just stuck off there like Napoleon, is stuck off, it's set off and banished. But really what we've discovered was on this Isle of Patmos were villages, and there were whole Roman cults and worshipping of their gods. And the culture he had to encounter was right there on Patmos. He didn't have to go back to Ephesus or Sardis or some of those other places. It was already there. And he could see where he was on this little island, the very power of God. So that's something I think that we probably sometimes tend to miss. Yes, Wayne?
Referring back to these pseudepigrapha, what is the stories really originate beyond what we have in our Bible? Where did the stories come from? Is there or the Scribes who wrote these down? Where did
they just simply emerged over many centuries. We say pseudepigrapha because I think most people, at least editors at a later time, didn't think they came directly from Enoch. But there were many other stories about Elijah, Elisha, the great prophets that we never made it into the biblical account.
As John says, there are many things that our Lord.
Yeah. And I'm not wanting to say that these are true stories. That's probably a good way of selecting, but those stories really, for them, convey religious and scientific and just general truths. They become vehicles where other ways of understanding things, maybe some of the philosophy of the ancient philosophy, is put into those stories. And so, the Jews are wonderful storytellers. Everything is done through stories. If you read the Talmud and so forth, they have a story for about everything. So it's not really surprising that they bring that out. Yes?
And also in the Talmud, I was going to bring that up, but also in the Talmud, don't the rabbis and whatnot have a historical way to verify stories when, for example, in the Talmud, and then that would go on over into the Scribes? We have a very specified rule for verification. Who knew who said it,
Yeah. Oh, I see what you're meaning. Yeah, because they sort of move the train back. Some Rabbi so and so told so and so that, and that forth. And so maybe a lot of those stories were just excluded there along the way. I didn't come in to them, although they have some pretty tall stories, even in the Talmud. In the Talmud. Yeah, I think if you just take the idea of apocalyptic, it's a way of bringing knowledge from various places to kind of fill out questions that they didn't see already being addressed in the Bible. Now, what I think is really interesting, and this is a good point, I think, which to finish up here today, what we find in these symbolic stories and so forth that we get, particularly in visions of Revelation, again, is a tying together of what John perceives as major and important themes in the biblical narrative. Can't stress that enough. It's really giving the whole of the biblical story a coherent ending. And even though John, of course, is addressing a particular constituency, 7 churches in Asia that are about to fall under tremendous assault from the Roman culture, in the way that he weaves together this story, it's an appropriate and a marvelous completion that still to this day functions as the appropriate ending to the biblical story. And once you get to see that, for example, in Revelation chapter 5, you get this wonderful picture of who Jesus is as the Lamb and his final victory of redemption. In Revelation chapter 11, you have this wonderful picture of what it means for the church to witness to the world. And in Revelation chapter 21, you have this wonderful picture of the New Jerusalem, of what God has always wanted for his people and for Jerusalem. And it is just breathtaking when you get this idea that all of this carries a coherent message of encouragement for the Christian life. So, we get into that and see it from that perspective. It's not at all frightening or difficult. So I hope that I've at least convinced you of that today. Now, before we all go home, what we need to do for next week. Okay, we need to get down to work to study the circumstances, background of the production of the book of Revelation. And here I've, I think, broken a little bit of new ground, and that's why I've given you, and everybody make sure they've got a copy or access to a copy of my chapters here on chapter 5, the conversion of the nation, the central message of the apocalypse, because in that chapter you'll find on page 113 there a display that I want you to study, and we'll talk some next week about this, about the outline of the book. Its structure and outline do not look very sexy, but they are very, very important to understand the book of Revelation. Maybe not